In northern Nigeria, representatives of many ancient peoples accompany their traditional leaders at a great durbar. Its pageantry recalls the strength and splendor of a treasured past. In the eastern region of Nigeria, boatmen from the Niger Delta display the war canoes of the past and show the zest and energy which made their forefathers great warriors and traders. And in western Nigeria, a graceful dance by a proud and sophisticated people whose ancient art is admired all over the world. The Hausa, the Fulani, the Igbo, and the Yoruba, along with many other groups of peoples, large and small. These are the 40 million Nigerians. And now they're binding themselves together in Africa's greatest experiment, the Federation of Nigeria. To the Federal House of Representatives in Lagos, they have sent their chosen leaders to create a united, independent, and modern nation out of the ancient peoples of the Niger. Nigeria is changing swiftly, but though skyscrapers are rising and new schools multiplying, ancient ways are still present and full of meaning. Africa, 3 times the size of Europe. For more than 200 million Africans, the pace of change is faster than anywhere else in the world. And nowhere has this change been faster than in West Africa and its most populous political unit, Nigeria. On the map, Nigeria appears a giant square stretching around the Great Y formed by the river Niger and its tributary, the Benue. Lying close to the equator, Nigeria is a tropical country, and every region has a distinct rainy season. But rainfall varies greatly, and this has molded Nigeria's geography into sharply defined zones. Along the coast, where rains are heaviest, lies a belt of mangrove swamps, interlaced with navigable creeks and rivers. Further inland, where rain is still heavy, lie dense and valuable rain forests, with mahogany, cedar, ebony, teak, and many other trees. As the rainfall decreases, the forests fade through grassy savanna and open parkland into the drier northern plains, where thorny scrub and sandy soil form a vast cattle range. Through all these regions flows Africa's 3rd greatest river, the Niger. The Niger long lay concealed by the swamp and forest barriers across its mouth. Only in the mid-19th century did it become a highway to the interior. In the Niger Basin live the densest concentration of peoples in all Africa, ranging from the predominantly Negro groups in the south to the predominantly Berber Arab groups in the north. A bewildering variety of peoples, running literally to hundreds. The Jukuns and Efiks, Igberas and Edos, Tivs and Nupes, each distinguishable by custom and language. But certain groups had long held a leading position among the Niger peoples. Foremost in the north were 2 peoples, the Hausa and the Fulani. Most numerous were the Hausa, a predominantly Negro race mixed with Berber Arab strains, whose legends say they came from the east 1,000 years ago. A friendly and amiable people, they were widely respected for their intelligence and wit. Farmers through the centuries, they utilized ingeniously the North's 2 brief rainy seasons to grow their millet, their guinea corn, ground nuts, and cotton. In their sturdy villages of adobe and thatch, an old and well-knit culture flourished. Children and young girls do a traditional wedding dance as the work of preparing food goes on around them. But the Hausa were also builders of towns, like Kano, center of one of the 7 original Hausa states. Kano was 1,000 years old, and its crumbling walls recall a warrior past. Kano of old had contact with the great world outside. As they still do, the camel trains set out across the vast sea of sand to Timbuktu, where the treasures of the Sudan were exchanged, and whose wealth and fame were known to the early mapmakers of Europe. Around Timbuktu arose the great Negro empire of Songhai, the summit of Sudanese culture. Successor to the earlier Negro kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, the Songhai Empire was celebrated for its prosperity, its civilization, and its learning. In the early 16th century, her power spread eastward and made the Hausa states part of her domain. Songhai passed away, but the Hausa towns like Kano continued to flourish down through the centuries as market and trading places. From Kano came famous cloths, stained in the matchless indigo of her dye pits. Her tenuous contact across the Sahara with the Mediterranean was never lost, and some of her products became known around the world. The Morocco leather that bound the volumes of Renaissance libraries really came from Kano, and the old skills with hides and skins still prevail. Long ago, the Hausa became Muslims. History and religion have tended to make them reach out across the desert toward the world of Islam, and to the stranger, their towns often seem to have the look of the Levant. The Hausa shared the Great Plains of the North with another important people, the Fulani. A nomadic and pastoral people famed as cattle herders, the Fulani drifted into the north from the 15th century on, mingling peacefully with the Hausa. The origin of the Fulani is much in dispute, but their features reveal a strong Berber Arab strain. Proud and self-reliant, they were fine horsemen and soldiers. Many moved to the Hausa towns, where their abilities rapidly won them places of influence and respect. Above all, they were devout Muslims, holding to the purity, order, and devotion of the Quranic code as their spiritual guide. In the early 19th century, religious zeal fired the Fulani to revolt. Calling for a holy war to halt the abuse of Islam, Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio roused the faithful. The Fulani rose, and after hard fighting, swept to victory through most of the north. But the resistance of southern people and later British penetration kept the Fulani from dipping the Koran in the sea. As it was, a large part of the area of modern Nigeria was united, and the supremacy of Islam assured. Thus arose the Empire of the Fulani, and its feudal leaders assumed rule over the Hausa. But the Hausa civilization and Muslim faith were confirmed and retained, and Fulani and Hausa lived together in unity until the coming of the British. To the south, across mid-Nigeria, lived many peoples, some large and relatively advanced groups, others small and backward. On a high plateau in mid-eastern Nigeria, in small, cactus-protected villages, lived one of a number of interesting groups who had spurned Islam and retained their own religion. They lived simply and quietly, concealed from strangers. They cultivated their arts and a pagan religion that was often of a high moral standard. Throughout their long history, the Middle Belt peoples retained their distinctive and vigorous dances. In eastern Nigeria, concentrated largely in one of the most densely populated parts of Africa, were another important people, the Igbo. The Igbo were famous traders, and for them the creeks and rivers were roads and highways for goods-laden canoes heading to the nearest trading beach. They spread their numerous villages through the tropical forests and grasslands of the region. The Igbo were respected for their strength and vigor, useful qualities for scaling the palm oil trees, whose fruit was eagerly sought by the early European traders. The Igbo had paramount chiefs, but local authority was strong, and a remarkable individualism flourished, where each man could have his say. Their religion was highly complex, and sometimes reflected an often hostile nature in striking masks, which rank among the finest purely African art. Other dances could reflect, too, moods of quiet peace and beauty. In the western region of Nigeria were another great people, the Yoruba. Fishermen and cultivators, this ancient people lived in a fertile and productive land, spreading back from the sea through pleasant forest and parkland dotted with villages. The origins of the Yoruba are uncertain, but their tradition looks back to Asia. They were a proud and sophisticated people whose ancient culture was one of the most remarkable in all Africa. Like all Nigerian peoples, the Yoruba are very fond of music. The voice of the famous talking drum is often heard in the streets. The Yoruba had many traditional leaders. They were among the first in Nigeria to feel European influence and to allow Christian ways to flourish beside their animist religion. The ancient Yoruba culture was a powerful one. At the sacred city of Ifa, the Oni, the divine king, was spiritual leader of a civilization whose sway was once felt from Accra to the Niger. The craftsmen of Ifa, skilled workers in bronze and terracotta, created one of the great peaks of African art. These celebrated sculptures reveal an idealized naturalism and a humanistic mode of representation. Striking, though more stylized heads were produced at nearby Benin and show the characteristic choker of Benin court dress. The divine kings, or obas, dominate a series of bronze wall plaques in which the people and events of ancient Benin were recorded. An event of supreme significance for all Africa was recorded with the intrusion among the images of obas and soldiers of a strange European face. They were the faces of Portuguese soldiers. Under sailors like da Gama, spurred by the Turkish closure of the Mediterranean and the lure of Sudanese gold, the Portuguese pushed steadily around the coast of Africa. In 1471, they had reached Benin, where early contacts were friendly. Soon, forts of many nations were trading briskly for gold, grain, ivory, and peppers. But the ambitious merchants were only guests, without territorial claims in African societies, which were on the whole prosperous and strong. This mutually beneficial trade was soon overshadowed by a different kind, one full of menace for many Africans, the slave trade. For 300 years, the slaver, Arab, African, or European, terrorized countless peaceful African villages, killing the defenders and herding the shackled captives across the desert or to the ocean. In this prolonged holocaust, none suffered more than the peoples of West Africa, and always numerous among the millions shipped to the New World were people we would now call Nigerians. But legitimate trade in products like palm oil continued to grow, especially with newly industrialized Britain, now dominant along the Niger coast. To ports like Calabar came the hulks, great floating stores which handled trade offshore. Although the existence of the River Niger had long been known, European maps for centuries had shown confused notions of its true course. The rising interest in trade now turned the efforts of explorers to the solution of this age-old mystery. A young Scotsman, Mungo Park, first established the easterly course of the Niger and was drowned later in his efforts to trace the river to its mouth. In 1830, Richard Lander discovered that the waters of the Niger led into the Gulf of Guinea, a potential highway for the trader. In the meantime, reformers like Wilberforce had so aroused the public conscience against the slave trade that it led to the Abolition Act of 1807. A naval squadron was sent to hunt down the slavers. The slavers often evaded capture by throwing overboard their human cargo. Britain finally struck at the slavers' base at Lagos and annexed it in 1861. Britain was now established on the coast of Nigeria. Only 4 years later, some British statesmen favored withdrawal from the Niger coast. But the welfare of an expanding trade was now of prime importance as companies pushed up the Niger to trade with the inhabitants. The British were not without rivals. France, already established on the Middle Niger, was sending her traders downstream. But the lucrative Niger trade was saved for Britain. The small British traders were united into a powerful organization, later called the Royal Niger Company, which negotiated treaties exchanging British protection for monopoly of trade over such vast areas of the Niger territories that an oil rivers protectorate, proclaimed in 1885 and later called the Niger Coast Protectorate, won international acceptance. Some did not recognize the British claims. Nigerian traders who resented these claims and were determined to halt the intruding monopoly which threatened their trading position. Men like King Jaja of Opobo, a skillful, well-organized trader. There were fierce attacks on British posts, followed inevitably by sharp reprisals. By 1900, the coastal regions were consolidated as the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, and the claims of the Niger Company reaffirmed by the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. The Muslim North, too, resented this infidel intrusion. Several Fulani leaders rejected previous treaty claims and opposed the British. Major campaigns were needed before British forces under Lugard pacified the North. In 1914, the whole territory was united as the Colony and Protectorate of Nigeria. In 1918, a strip of the German Cameroons was added under mandate. This later became a UN Trust territory. Out of his wide experience throughout Africa, the first Governor-General of the United Nigeria, Frederick Lugard, had developed his own theories about the best method of ruling conquered peoples. He had noticed that friendly relations with defeated leaders were possible if British goals were pursued indirectly and the powers of the old rulers left largely intact. This was the system of indirect rule, which guided British-African relations for half a century. Nowhere was this system more successful than in northern Nigeria. Here, the well-organized and strong Fulani leadership accepted a system which respected Islam and left an effective role for the former rulers. Even though, in the last analysis, the new rulers had the final say and would naturally see that only those local leaders were appointed who would not oppose British interests. In practice, indirect rule became native administration, which allowed traditional leaders to govern their territory largely according to their own laws and customs, but with British officials headed by a resident to advise them. And thus the new administration preserved the traditional leader and his council, but each official now had a British opposite number at his side, who could wield great influence. Often this influence achieved valuable reforms. Local customs, which seemed to conflict with more modern ideas, were gradually modified. Tax rights were now held by the British, and an annual budget was an important step towards other improvements. Among these were the beginnings of a medical system, which brought scientific knowledge into action against the difficult tropical diseases which had long harassed Nigerians. The district officers often inspired innovations they felt would not disrupt the traditional patterns which indirect rule hoped to preserve. Local legal systems were generally left intact, But now British-style courts were also available, where sometimes a different approach was useful. With the support of local leaders, a great deal could be achieved. A better road, a more efficient link with the outside world. These were advances for the local people. But law and order, health, better communications also suited British purposes. For Frederick Lugard originated another famous theory too, the dual mandate. To develop the great untapped wealth of Nigeria's forests and fields was a positive duty to all mankind, said Lugard. Britain would benefit greatly, but so also would the Nigerians. Some of this wealth had long been exploited by various Nigerian groups using their own methods of production. British policy of indirect rule preferred to leave this production to local producers, and large plantations owned by outsiders were discouraged. A cheap product in large quantities was the main concern. Nigerians were encouraged to increase production not only of palm oil, but of other great cash crops too, like groundnuts, cotton, cocoa, and so on. Along a railway system which reached all the way to ancient Kano, largely the work of a Canadian engineer, Sir Percy Girard, the products flowed to the new harbors of Port Harcourt and Lagos. Nigeria began to count in world trade statistics, but her trade was largely British enterprise, with markets and prices controlled from London, where there was much less concern with developing local processing of Nigerian products than with cheap exports to Britain. There was expansion too in old Lagos, which became the commercial center of British trading operations. Here were concentrated the small number of Europeans in Nigeria, businessmen rather than settlers, whose orientation was still to the motherland. Perhaps Britain's greatest achievement in Nigeria was the creation of a centralized government, which, though colonial in character, considered Nigeria as a unit. But Nigerians saw the dual mandate differently. They had kept their land, but the return on their crops was limited by their poor bargaining position with buyers. New jobs were available too, but mainly handling the massive flow of exports or working in the tin mines for the British. Many felt that in practice, Lugard's theory was somewhat one-sided, that the efficient development of cheap raw materials inevitably took priority over the maximum advancement of Nigerians, who saw themselves likely to be cast permanently in the role of low-cost labor. Some also resented limiting Nigerian enterprise to low-profit exports, while high-cost imports came from Britain. Nigerians felt that they had too little control over the prices at which they bought and sold. There was strong feeling that too much of the profits of commercial enterprise in Nigeria went to outside investors, while the welfare of the many Nigerians who served this enterprise tended to be neglected. Indirect rule, too, bred many problems, for the imperial presence, though subtle, was real. Even if the taxes brought tangible benefits, there was always reluctance to pay for an alien rule. Indirect rule failed badly in the East, where it clashed with the Igbo tradition of responsible local authority. The Igbo felt that a system where the real power lay elsewhere made a mockery of traditional authority. It was perhaps no accident that an early spokesman for Nigerian nationalism was an Igbo. The great achievement of Nnamdi Azikiwe was to sum up in popular language the growing hostility to imperialism. The dual mandate, he said, was exploitation. Indirect rule was a false goal. The new Nigeria, a British administrative creation, he said, must be Nigerianized. His party, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, called for a democratically elected administration and independence.
We have learned to live under the rule of law. We have learned to fight for the freedom of the individual. Would you like to substitute this so that a number of...
The British, too, were moving ahead. Back in 1922, Nigeria had been the first British African dependency to gain the elective principle. But the elected Africans were a small minority in purely advisory bodies, and the governor and his executive council still had the final say. The Richards Constitution of 1947 established regional assemblies, mostly nominated and advisory in the North, West, and East. These also sent representatives to a new Central Legislative Council in Lagos. All these bodies contained, for the first time, a majority of Africans, and at Lagos, nominated and elected members from all Nigeria deliberated for the whole country. These were gains. But the nationalists pointed out that real power remained with the governor and his executive, and politically, Nigeria was still where she was 25 years before. These and other complaints were soon carried to London. Nationalist leaders criticized the trend toward regionalism. They felt it promoted separatism instead of unity and national feeling. The British argued that the system respected the inescapable diversity of Nigeria's regions, that rather than being divisive, they fused the many small groups into three, which might someday become one. Regional interests did become realities. For the next constitution, drawn up with Nigerian help, cast its important advances in a regional pattern. The Constitution of 1951 took a big step by recognizing the principle of elections, although it retained electoral colleges. The general election that followed was a major advance toward real political expression. The Northerners took to the rules of the game with evident enthusiasm. In the east, coal miners from Enugu were eager participants. In the villages, the election was usually held outside, and voters lined up as the polling officers prepared papers for them. In the west as well, great care was taken to see that all could vote in secrecy. Even skeptics were impressed by the obvious seriousness with which people held the privilege of having a say in choosing their representatives. In the north, the Northern People's Congress had won, and in cooperation with the traditional rulers, prepared a program of advancement for their region. In the Richards Constitution, the role of the assemblies had been only advisory. Now their powers were real, and their decisions would become laws. In the east, the supporters of Dr. Azikiwe swept the field. In the assembly, they pressed energetically for further political advances and a strong central government. In 1951, the regions were given control of their budgets and wide powers in local matters. By 1954, when the Constitution was revised, the regions attained full executive powers in regional affairs. In the West, the Action Group had been victorious and contributed to a distinguished record in the Western House. After 1951, majority parties started forming governments, and majority leaders became premiers with a responsible cabinet of ministers. Federally, the old Legislative Council was first replaced by a House of Representatives, chosen by the regions through the Electoral College system. A council of ministers with a Nigerian majority took over from the old Executive Council. By 1954, the Federal House was directly elected by the people, and Nigeria, with clear-cut federal and regional areas of authority, had become a true federation. Though the question of national independence remained, the rapid Nigerianization of the country was a reality. And when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip toured Nigeria in 1956, the enthusiastic reception underlined the cordial basis of Nigerian-British relations. The Queen congratulated all Nigerians on their quick and full response to the new political opportunities. Nigerian leaders of all parties indicated that while they remained steadfast in the cause of early independence, they looked with favor on the retention of Commonwealth ties. In 1958, a welcome guest at North America's Great St. Lawrence Seaway project was one of Nigeria's new ministers, Chief Festus Okotie-Eboh. His presence in Canada at the Commonwealth Economic Conference emphasized Nigeria's desire to make full use of Commonwealth contacts. The minister foresaw big projects in Nigeria's future, too, and pointed out that outside capital and technical assistance would be welcome if they were adapted to Nigerian needs. In 1956, the eastern and western regions did attain full regional self-government, and the North followed in 1958. Their legislatures were now fully sovereign in their fields, and responsible only to them, the premiers and their picked executive councils had complete control of policy. The rapid Nigerianization of government created everywhere a desperate need for administrative personnel. Special institutes to train administrators were set up, like the one at Zaria in the north. Good government needs good men at all levels, and here future officials study their role in tackling the many problems of a developing Nigeria. The annual fishing festival on the Niger dramatizes how heavy the demand for food the huge and expanding population of Nigeria must make, even on a land that is highly fruitful. And Nigeria is a productive land, as the rich variety of foods in their marketplaces shows. But a great deal more will be needed. Also, traditional diets are often one-sided, even though variety is near at hand. Most Nigerians are subsistence farmers, selling also their surplus of ground nuts or millet or cassava or yams. To help them, agricultural science is now widely taught. They learn about cover crops, which preserve topsoil, the superiority of intensive over extensive farming, and about the use of machines. Meat production has long been a major activity in the north. A familiar sight at Kano markets are the rings of smoking zoya. But cattle diseases have always plagued the great herds of the north. From the tsetse fly comes trypanosomiasis, deadly waster of herds. Throughout the north, clinics and control posts are being established to check and treat animals with preventive injections. Advanced research in trypanosomiasis is carried on at Vom. Products of the land provide a full half of Nigeria's national income. Experimental plantations and research centers, both government and private, have developed better methods of production and handling and improved oil extraction processes. The results so obtained have helped the government of the eastern region to set up many local oil mills, handy to rural producers, which produce a much better product and therefore a higher income. Lying across southern Nigeria is a large section of the vast rainforest belt, which stretches for 3,000 miles through West Africa. Intensive mechanization is greatly increasing the yield from these tremendous forests. Outside capital has helped here, and the showplace of the lumber industry is the huge British-operated mill at Sapele, one of the finest in the world. But with government help, a Nigerian lumber industry is also developing. Nigeria's main cash crops are grown largely by small producers. For them, cooperatives have been most useful in overcoming the disadvantages of smallness, providing marketing facilities and small loans. Important, too, have been the unique marketing boards, like the one for the cocoa industry of the western region. Responsible for handling the entire crop, the boards assist producers by guaranteeing prices and sales and by setting high standards of quality. A third of the world's palm oil, a third of its groundnuts, most of its columbite, as well as lumber, tin, cocoa, and bananas now come from Nigeria. With favorable world markets, Nigeria can earn a living, but her development makes heavy demands on her earnings for expensive imports like machinery. Outside capital has been very useful in some developments, like the oil industry. Since 1937, when search for oil began, a number of important finds have been made in the coastal areas of the eastern region. In 1960, exports of oil are expected to reach 1 million tons. Anyone who visits a Nigerian marketplace soon finds that there is no shortage of local business talent. In the past, many Nigerians were big traders, but superior European capital soon dominated larger activities. Nigerian business remained numerous but small. Beautifully decorated calabashes, rich patterned cloths, and a tremendous variety of colorful pottery. These Nigerians have always manufactured. But without machines like the potter's wheel, production was pretty slow. To help these ancient crafts compete in modern conditions, new government schools teach village craftsmen improved methods. Results seem to show that better techniques can give old crafts a new lease of life. Just as their fathers and grandfathers did before them, the glassmakers of Bida tend their fires and mold the red-hot glass into intricate bracelets and beads, which have made the name Bida world famous. Dipping and re-dipping until the matchless colors are achieved, generations of experience are still at work at the historic dye pits of Kano. Handloom weaving, an old village industry, is encouraged at government training centers. At the same time, large modern textile mills are built, such as the one at Kaduna, built by the Northern Region Development Corporation with technical assistance from a British firm. More and more Nigerian products are being processed at home. This modern groundnut oil extraction plant turns out 300 barrels a day. Kano's reputation for high-quality products is carefully preserved at her modern tannery. Women of the Middle Region bring milk to a dehydration plant. Machines provided by the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund in a building provided by the government of the northern region, produce powdered milk for Nigeria's clinics and hospitals. Canning food is an important step toward improved distribution of food and makes possible a better balanced diet everywhere. The new cement plant built jointly by the federal government and the Eastern Region Development Corporation will help reduce one expensive import. An emir's personal trumpeter welcomes the traveler to Kana's great airport, only a few jet hours from Europe. The railway system now has diesels to pull the country's cash crops to the southern ports. One of Britain's earliest achievements in Nigeria, the extension of the railway system is given every priority by the federal government. Nigeria's local roads have always left much to be desired. Today, modern equipment is making an efficient road system a practical possibility. Much of this work is done by well-organized local governments. The old isolation is ending, and Nigerians now move about their country much more than formerly. One result of this is that rapidly growing cities like Ibadan, Lagos, Port Harcourt, Onitsha are becoming melting pots, where Nigerians tend to lose old differences. Everywhere, the expanding economy is throwing up new buildings, often in an attractive and characteristic West African style. There has also been progress in cleaning up the slum growths of earlier times. The new houses replacing the slums of Lagos portray the rising expectations of ordinary Nigerians. Disease was an ever-present menace for many Nigerians. An apparently healthy man could suddenly sink in pain. Perhaps inadequate diet had produced an agonizing hernia. And there were more frightening enemies, the age-old diseases of the tropics. The guinea worm, leprosy, most feared of all. There was malaria, there was sleeping sickness, smallpox that could blind a man or scar his body for the rest of his days. You must be vaccinated, cries the signboard. And people are. In towns and villages all over Nigeria, a campaign against smallpox has been pressed by the Federal Health Services. The once incurable diseases are now known to be curable. Final success against malaria and sleeping sickness is now possible, but only if the pests that cause them are pursued into every village and every house. In older times, disgrace, segregation, and death were the certain fate of the leper. Today, if it's discovered early enough, modern drugs can effect a cure. Now, government clinics examine every likely suspect immediately, and this terrible scourge may soon be wiped out. Both the federal and regional governments have vastly increased expenditures on new medical facilities. But these can only be increased as rapidly as there are doctors to staff them. A series of well-equipped training hospitals is turning out an ever-increasing stream of qualified Nigerian doctors, nurses, and specialists. One important consequence of the British presence in Nigeria was the introduction of Christianity, which won many converts in the West and East, and some even in the Islamic North. Christianity of various denominations is a living force in Nigeria today, because over a century ago, to the Yoruba country, to Lagos, to Old Calabar, came a devoted band of men and women of many denominations. determined to Christianize the African. They preached the gospel, but English too, and then arithmetic and other things. Teaching became their work, and in their own way, they put the keys to Western civilization into Nigerian hands. And when a government school system grew up, it was denominational and operated by the missionaries. For a long time, Nigerian students had to go outside for higher education, usually to the United Kingdom. Few in number at first. After the war, the number rapidly increased, and many still go abroad for specialized training. When the University of Ibadan opened in 1948, higher education became available on Nigerian soil. Modeled on the British system, it has become an institution of the highest standards. Now, at Nsukka, in the eastern region, a new university is rising. Built entirely with funds accumulated by the Regional Marketing Board, it will be twice as large as Ibadan. But the great feat of the new Nigeria was free universal education in the eastern and western regions. In the eastern region, it meant a 5-fold increase in enrollment in just 4 years. No less astonishing has been progress in the north, where the traditions of the past are especially cherished. This is a Quranic school, where the principles of Islam are taught. The children of the northern region are now learning their alphabet in primary schools like these. Thousands of these schools have brought the dream of universal free education within reach for the whole region. Higher mathematics and the other disciplines which underlie modern technical knowledge are given top priority, for Nigeria is becoming more and more a world of plans and machines. The men who will draw the plans and operate the machines will be Nigerians, trained in Nigeria. The pursuit of knowledge has been described as Nigeria's national passion. The Eastern Region Library Board has sought to foster this urge with mobile libraries. A vital, colorful, and outspoken press has played a big role in popular and political education. Meanwhile, there was rapid political evolution. Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was appointed to the new post of federal prime minister, and with other Nigerian leaders attended a major constitutional conference in London in 1958. By this time, the case for Nigerian independence had become overwhelming, and Nigerian leaders heard that Britain would grant independence if a newly elected federal parliament clearly desired it. Election time, and the talking drums shouted in the streets. Chief Obafemi Awolowo, leader of the action group, favored modern methods of electioneering and was able to drop in personally on supporters in widely scattered areas. The National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons always knew how to put on a good show, but people came also to hear the father of militant Nigerian nationalism, the trailblazer of Nigeria's road to independence, Nnamdi Azikiwe. A brilliant orator and a fierce competitor, he never failed to rouse the enthusiasm of his followers. The campaign of the Northern People's Congress was led by Sir Amadou Bello, the distinguished Sardana of Sokoto, a living symbol of the blending of past and present. Sir Abubakar, first Prime Minister of the Federation and Deputy Party Leader, shared the rigors of the campaign with the Sardona. On Election Day, over 75% of the registered voters turned out. They were voting for a federal House of 312 members, from whose majority party a cabinet would be chosen to run the country. During the day, His Excellency the Governor General, Sir James Robertson, whose powers by now had become purely formal, visited the polls to talk to voters. Better than anyone else, he knew that at all points where real power was involved, Nigeria had been practicing independence for some time. Elections over, a coalition government tabled a motion requesting independence. During the debate, Britain's Prime Minister, Sir Harold Macmillan, heard the Prime Minister of Nigeria state that at the beginning of the struggle for independence, Nigeria had challenged Britain. At the end, Britain had challenged Nigeria. The motion passed unanimously, and independence was confirmed. From the many has come one. This one is Nigeria, a giant in Africa, proven creation of history and design, whose influence as an independent nation, both on her own continent and on the world at large, can be immense and beneficial.